Since we know that all equations have a slope and a y-intercept that we use to make the equation, we're going to pull them out and put them on the graph. The first thing that makes sense to put on the graph, let's think about this. Does it make sense to use the operation first or the start value first? Probably the start value, because it's the start, the beginning. It gives me a place to measure off of. The start value is the same thing as the y-intercept, right? So we're going to use our y-intercept first because that represents the beginning of the pattern. That's why we sometimes call it the start value. So our first step, like I said, this is a two-step deal. So first step is going to be to identify, because we have to pull it back out of the equation. So identify, and then we're going to take that y-intercept or that start value and we're going to mark it on the graph because we know where the y-intercept or the start value is supposed to go on the graph. So I'm going to put what we're going to do on the outside and then we'll actually do it on the inside. So our first step, so identify, and then we're going to mark on the graph. So identify and mark the y-intercept, which we know is the same thing as the start value. I'm going to open this up. So identify and mark the y-intercept. In order to do identifying, we need an equation to work with. So we're going to write the equation over here, and then we'll actually do the step on the graph that I gave you. So here's our equation we're going to work with. Y equals 3 minus 4/5 x. So the first thing we have to do is identify the y-intercept or the start value. So if I'm just looking at this equation, what's the y-intercept? 3, exactly. That's kind of like what you guys are doing in your warm-up. Just pull it out. Okay, and then, so that's identified, but now we have to mark it on the graph. We've talked about where the start value always goes on the graph. Where does it always go? 0, which is on the y-axis. So I can say, okay, the start value is 3. So I'm going to come here at 0 on the y-axis and go 1, 2, 3, which means my start value goes right there, right? So that gives me a place to measure from. So that's the first step. The next step involves reversing the process of finding the slope on a graph. I've used my y-intercept. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use the slope. So we have to figure out what the slope is, and then we're going to use the slope to find some points on the graph so that we know where the line goes. So our second step, identify the slope. And then we're going to use it on the graph. Use to get the next, what it's going to give us is the next whole number coordinate on the graph. So use to get the next whole number coordinate. Can I close our first flap? Open our second flap. So it's still the same equation. I'm going to rewrite it over here. And we already marked the y-intercept. Okay, so that's where we left off the last step. The next step is going to be to identify the slope. So my y-intercept is 3. What's my slope? Exactly, -4/5. So I'm going to circle it just to identify it. Now, I'm going to mark it on the graph. As a reminder, and I'm actually going to take the slope and I'm going to kind of pull it down here so we can label some things. So here's our slope. If this were a graph and we had found the slope of the graph, we would be measuring our rise and our run. So we would be looking to see how much does it go up and how much does it go over to get the top number and the bottom number, right? So let's think for a minute. The top number, is that my up and down number or my side to side number? That's my up and down number. So if I were measuring the slope, I would look and see how much I'm going up, and that becomes the top number of my fraction. This is negative though, so do I want to go up or down? Right, down. So the top number always controls our up and down movement. And in this case, I'm going to put this in red, what we're actually doing. We want to go down because this is a negative slope, right? So we're going to go down 4 when we actually do this on a graph. This is the up and down number. That means the bottom has to be my side to side number. And I'm going to give you guys a piece of advice from many years of teaching this. The negative, think of the negative as controlling the up and down. And the sideways, some of you guys, I've given you this piece of advice that you read a graph the same way you read a book. So when we read a book, we start on the left and we go to the right, right? So math kind of works the same way. Reading a graph in math is a lot like reading a book. We go from left to right. So think of the negative as controlling the up or down, and then this is always going to be to tell you how do I get from left to right. So I always want to count this one to the right, and it'll help you avoid confusion. Otherwise, people get scrambled on what the negative does, and they end up doing some weird backwards things and end up with wrong graphs. So if you think of that up versus down, and then this always goes left to right, it will help you to not make some mistakes. So I'm going to say that always goes to the right. So this is going to go to the right 5. So we're just reversing that process of how we would get this off the graph. When we pull it off the graph, we make a fraction that tells us how much to go up and how much to go over. Now we're going to do that same thing, but we're putting it back on the graph. So that means I want to start at my start value. And first I need to go down 4. So 1, 2, 3, 4. So down 4, right? And then over 5. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Over 5. That means my next point's going to be right there. Do you guys see the little triangle, the slope triangle that we made? The same slope triangle we used to get it off the graph. And then in math, we like to connect the points because it shows the pattern. So I could go ahead and draw the line, and then I could put arrows on both ends just as a way of saying, hey, the pattern keeps going. I could find more points this way, and I could find more points this way too.